Kings and Generals is proud to announce that this is one of the many incredible channels that we've partnered up with for Project Ukraine. Project Ukraine is a playlist dedicated to telling the past of the Ukrainian people to aid them in the present. Your likes, shares and donations to the charity we're collaborating with will have a direct impact in aiding the most vulnerable citizens of Ukraine. We have partnered up with the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, which was bombed by the Russian troops at the start of the invasion. Today, the foundation has transformed its projects, refocusing its resources and efforts on purchasing and delivering humanitarian aid to civilians and evacuating people from combat zones. In the first week of April, the center provided over 7,000 food baskets to patients and doctors at Kyiv hospitals, to bomb shelters in the Kyiv underground, as well as to people with disabilities and elderly people who cannot leave their homes. They also provided targeted assistance to 3,354 people, delivering specific medications, food and hygiene products on individual requests. We hope that viewers would consider donating to this noble cause and help with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
The territory of today's Ukraine has long been a battleground of empires. It has regularly found itself sandwiched between larger powers, being conquered by one or the other or divided back and forth throughout history. In the first half of the 17th century, most of the region was under the authority of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, this region had an independent spirit that lasted throughout its history. This was most fiercely embodied in the local Cossacks of the Zaporizhian host. In 1648, under the leadership of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, this independent spirit would boil over into rebellion, leading to the first internationally recognized independent Ukrainian state, the Zaporizhian Hetmanate. Before we get into the rebellion, we need a basic overview of the earlier history of Ukraine. Ukraine's earliest written history dates back to the 9th century, with the foundation of the Kievan Rus, a collection of princedoms ruled by the Rurikid dynasty. The Kievan state was never particularly centralized, being made up of many princedoms which experienced their own internal divisions and conflicts. But the various princedoms were held together by a common recognition of Rurikid authority, and after multi-generational state conversion efforts, by the adoption of Orthodox Christianity. This state would completely disintegrate in the mid-13th century, when the Mongols rolled into town and conquered the whole thing. The region would be controlled by vassals of the Mongol Golden Horde until the mid-14th century, when Mongol power in the region waned. The Kingdom of Ruthenia, a Mongol vassal which controlled much of today's Ukraine, would be partitioned between Poland and Lithuania, and in 1569 would be incorporated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the east of the former Kievan Rus, meanwhile, the decline of Mongol power saw the princedom of Muscovy consolidate its power over the other Rus princedoms of the area. The declining Golden Horde also left another successor state in the south of Ukraine, the Crimean Khanate. One lasting legacy of the Mongol Empire in the region was the rise of the Cossacks, a collection of horse-riding steppe people who lived in the so-called wild fields sandwiched between several of Eastern Europe's major states. Cossacks were a diverse bunch, descending from an assortment of steppe warriors and escaped peasants, drawn together by a common desire for freedom which they found through a semi-nomadic life on the steppe. It's not entirely clear how far back their origins go, with some historians arguing that they represent continuity from the Cuman inhabitants of the steppe, and others suggesting that they represent a collection of wayward Tatars and various Eastern European peoples who decided to join them in their nomadic way of life. Either way, by the time people started writing about them, they were Slavic-speaking, mostly Eastern Orthodox group defined more by their territory and lifestyle than anything else. Their name, Cossack, comes from a Turkic word meaning free man or adventurer, emphasizing this lifestyle, and they took great pride in their sense of freedom. The Cossacks didn't have a firm state of their own, instead living in loose military fraternities. These can be divided into two main groups, focused around two different rivers. In the east, the Don Cossacks were focused around the Don River, officially falling under the Russian Tsar's authority. In the west, focused around the Dnieper River, and under the authority of Poland-Lithuania, was the Zaporizhian host, who will be the focus of this video. Early on, the Cossacks were nomadic, living in yurt-style hide tents, but over time they increasingly developed permanent settlements with houses of wood or clay, and fortifications to protect themselves and their flocks. Politically, they stood out from their neighbors in their unique mix of democratic and highly authoritarian elements. They maintained a sort of democratic structure, called the Krug, to make decisions on the most important matters, usually trying to reach consensus rather than a simple majority. However, not all affairs were handled by the Krug, and for others, especially military leadership, they would elect a leader, called a hetman in the Dnieper region. As much as the Cossacks prized their freedom, they were expected to place absolute trust in the hetman's will, and indiscipline could be met with severe punishment. By the mid-16th century, the Cossacks of the Dnieper had developed a central headquarters known as the Zaporizhian Sich, a fortified island where representatives of the various Zaporizhian armies would meet periodically to elect a central hetman. Until the late 17th century, the Cossacks deemed farming to be beneath free men, instead relying on raiding and trade to obtain produce. Piracy and brigandry were popular occupations among them, but they also sold fish, meat, and hides for the money needed to buy grain. Their lack of self-sufficiency and tendency towards risky raids made them vulnerable, however, and at times they sought a more sustainable arrangement. In the Dnieper region, therefore, they would often turn to the Polish king to obtain stable employment as frontier troops, referred to as registered Cossacks. In exchange for their agreement to man border fortifications, the Cossacks would receive payment and supplies, sustaining their lifestyle. The majority of Cossacks would fluctuate between being registered and independent members of the Zaporizhian host. The Cossacks had always been a rebellious bunch, skirmishing with Polish forces on occasion throughout their history, but by the 1640s, greater tensions had begun to build. While the monarchy had previously granted the Cossacks a certain degree of autonomy, they began asserting greater control over their border territories during this period. In 1638, the king tried to revert the role of hetman into an appointed position rather than an elected one. While unsuccessful, this attempt to infringe on Cossack freedoms no doubt left a bad taste in their mouths. Additionally, among wealthy, registered Cossacks, there was a sense of frustration over the fact that, even when they obtained landed estates, the king wouldn't grant them noble status. In 1646, he promised to amend this by granting a charter of nobility in exchange for service in a campaign against the Ottomans, as well as promising to uphold their ancient liberties, but the deal fell through after the king faced opposition in the Sejm, Poland's version of parliament. Quick note, Poland-Lithuania was a constitutional elective monarchy from the late 16th century, hence why the king couldn't act unilaterally. The 17th century also marked a shift in Eastern European patterns of expansion, including an increased level of Polish settlement in the border regions, especially by nobles, who became landlords to Ruthenian peasants. The grievances of the Cossacks kept building up, until in 1648 they reached their final straw. Bohdan Khmelnytsky was a landholding registered Cossack with an estate near modern-day Chierin. Khmelnytsky was probably already upset with the Polish authorities in 1646, having been in Warsaw when King Władysław's negotiations with the Sejm were falling through. Allegedly, the king even voiced his frustrations to Khmelnytsky directly, complaining that the sanatoriums had succeeded in their will, and that he was little listened to. Khmelnytsky began riding around meeting with various Cossack leaders in 1647, which raised the suspicions of Polish authorities. Whether he was plotting a rebellion already isn't clear, but the Polish nobles of his home territory seem to have used the suspicion to conspire against him. Though Khmelnytsky had a royal charter to his estate, the local authorities redrew the boundaries, and a local noble laid claim to the land. The estate was raided, Khmelnytsky's young son was badly beaten, and he was even arrested and sentenced to death, though he was able to avoid execution with the help of some friends he had among the local officers. Though he took the incident all the way up the court system to the king himself, Khmelnytsky never received true justice for his case. He took his anger with the system to the Sich, arguing that they were due for a rebellion. With Khmelnytsky's service record and persuasive rhetoric, the Sich fell behind him, electing him as their new hetman. However, the Cossacks knew they couldn't beat the Poles alone. They looked to a neighboring power, one with a long-standing hostile relationship with the Poles, occupied by a people who the Cossacks had often bristled against, yet who had a lot more in common with them than their Polish overlords. That's right, the Crimean Khanate. The Tatars sent 4,000 horsemen to aid them, and they marched northwest. As they experienced initial successes against the Polish troops sent to meet them, word spread, and more Cossacks began to join in, including many registered Cossacks defecting from the Polish side. It wasn't only Cossacks who were encouraged by their victories, however. As they marched, Ruthenian peasants began to rise up themselves, attacking their lords, looting their estates, and also looting Catholic churches, and slaughtering priests, and conducting pogroms against Jewish people. Oh boy, we're gonna need some more context for this. See, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a primarily Catholic country ruled over by Catholic monarchs, but up until the 16th century, they'd remained fairly tolerant of religious diversity within the empire. In addition to the primarily Eastern Orthodox Ruthenians and Cossacks, the Commonwealth was fairly tolerant of Jews, who had a long history of settlement and freedom of worship within Poland. With the tolerance they experienced, some Jews were also able to achieve economic success, and they were thus able to actively participate in Polish settlement of Rus lands as landlords. Catholics and Jews alike were therefore associated with the Polish-Lithuanian authorities by the rebels, and slaughtered en masse, along with ethnic Poles. Jewish people were hit exceptionally hard though, with thousands dying in rebel attacks, and many who escaped murder being enslaved by Crimean Tatars. Khmelnytsky has gone down in Jewish history as the initiator of one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres of the pre-modern era, But it's important to note that, while there's no reason to assume he would have been specifically opposed to these actions, Khmelnytsky probably didn't have much control over the people committing them. In fact, while the Ruthenian peasants were motivated to rise up by Khmelnytsky's rebellion, he himself had no interest in freeing any serfs, and even ordered his own forces to suppress them for a time, though he'd eventually recognized that peasant revolts could be leveraged against Polish authority. Still, the Cossack forces engaged in anti-Jewish pogroms of their own, so we'd be remiss to act like it was just the peasants rising up against Jewish landlords, as Polish and Russian sources of the time tended to overemphasize. To quote from an eyewitness testimony about the actions of the Cossacks,
"Wherever they found a Szlachta, royal officials, or Jews, they killed them all, sparing neither women nor children. They pillaged the estates of the Jews and nobles, burned churches, and killed their priests, leaving nothing whole. It was a rare individual in those days who had not soaked his hands in blood."
It's tempting to see certain parallels to recent events in the Cossack Uprising, but it's important that we keep in mind that such parallels are only superficial, and the rebels shouldn't be valorized in the hopes of tying their legacy to modern Ukrainians. So make no mistake, this was a brutal ethnocentric rebellion, and many innocent people were slaughtered entirely out of misplaced rage. Keep that in mind moving forward. Despite early successes, Khmelnytsky didn't push his momentum to march into Poland proper, instead keeping his forces around Kyiv and settling into negotiations with the Poles. King Władysław had died earlier that year, and the newly appointed King Jan II promised to grant Cossacks and Orthodox Christians privileges if Khmelnytsky would just stop the rebellion. Khmelnytsky agreed, declaring victory. The way he interpreted this victory, however, may not have been quite what the Polish king had in mind. When Khmelnytsky marched into Kyiv for a victorious parade on Christmas Day of 1648, he was hailed as the Moses, savior, redeemer, and liberator of the Rus people from Polish captivity, and the illustrious ruler of Rus. Rather than simply regaining lost privileges within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Zaporizhian Cossacks had now declared their authority over an independent Rus state. Not only that, but they declared their sole authority over the territory, in contrast to the hopes of the Ruthenian nobility and Orthodox clergy, who had hoped for the Metropolitan of Kyiv to be placed on equal footing with the Cossack hetman. In February of the next year, Khmelnytsky declared himself the sole Rus autocrat during negotiations with a Polish delegation, and it became apparent to the envoys that he had denied all Ukraine and all Rus to the Poles. He was recognized in a Vilnius panegyric in 1650, which stated, "While in Poland it is King Jan II Kazimierz Vasa, in Rus it is Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky," and was called the Illustrimus Princeps, or Dux by many foreigners, while the Ottoman Sultan called him a prince and a monarch. By all accounts, Ukraine was at this point an independent state under the Zaporizhian Hetmanate. The Poles submit to a number of Cossack requests in the Treaty of Zborov of August 1649, including increasing the number of registered Cossacks, granting privileges to the Orthodox Church, and even banning Polish soldiers and, for some reason Jews in general, from entering the 3 voivodeships under Cossack control. However, Polish nobles were allowed to return, and this caused some problems as they found most of their former serfs declaring themselves Cossacks and refusing to return to work. This prompted the Polish nobles to send private guards against their old peasants. Meanwhile, Khmelnytsky didn't hold to the treaty either, raising the number of registered Cossacks beyond the agreed amount. In 1651, these issues resulted in the return of hostilities between Poland and the Cossacks. However, this time, the Cossacks didn't do so well. Several major defeats led their Crimean allies to abandon them, and with their alliance ended, the Tatars even went back to raiding the Cossack lands. Suddenly, Khmelnytsky found himself very much on the back foot. Unable to fight off the Poles with Moxie alone, and suffering from crop issues and Tatar raids, he turned to another neighboring power for help, this time looking east to the Russian Tsardom. Russian Tsar Alexei was at first hesitant to lend his support to rebels against a legitimate monarchy, but eventually he was convinced that the benefits outweighed the risks, and put forth the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654. However, the negotiations of this treaty made it clear that the Russians and Ukrainians had very different conceptions of law, corporate status, and obligations. This became apparent when the Tsar's envoy refused to join Khmelnytsky in taking an oath to abide by the agreed terms, stating that the Tsar could not bind himself to a subject. This clearly set off Khmelnytsky's alarm bells. He was no subject of the Tsar, and he promptly walked out of the negotiations, before quickly returning and accepting assurances of good faith in place of an oath, after he remembered what he was up against. The Cossacks pledged their eternal loyalty to the Tsar, and the Tsar, in turn, promised to send supplies and respect their rights to elect their own hetman and accept foreign envoys, provided these envoys weren't hostile to Russia. The right of the Ruthenian nobles to property and hereditary possessions was also acknowledged, with such nobles replacing the Polish nobility as the ruling class of the Hetmanate. Though they reimposed the feudal order, it's important to note that serfdom was not reinstated at this time, with peasants remaining unbound from the land. Functionally, nothing about Ukraine's political status changed at this point. Although the Russians established a garrison in Kyiv, and the Tsar added Grand Prince of Kyiv and Chernihiv, and Tsar of Great, Little, and White Russia to his title, with Little Russia referring to Ukraine and White Russia Belarus, the Zaporizhian host remained in effect a separate, independently governed state, called the Rus state, or Hosudarstvo Rossiyske by Khmelnytsky, and the Little Russian state by Muscovy. However, the Muscovite interpretation of their treaty with the Cossacks very clearly placed Ukraine as a part of Russia, and this would open the door for the state to be stripped of its autonomy down the line. With the Pereyaslav Treaty began the Russo-Polish War, also known as the First Northern War. The Russians occupied the west bank of the Dnieper, called the Left Bank, and much of Lithuania, and were potentially on track to topple the Polish monarchy. However, they were very clearly more focused on expanding their own holdings than helping the Cossacks expand their control over the western parts of Ukraine, as Khmelnytsky hoped. The situation got complicated as the First Northern War bled into the Second Northern War in 1655, when Poland-Lithuania was invaded by Sweden. You might assume that the Russians would see the Swedes as natural allies against the Poles, but you'd be mistaken. Instead, they viewed Sweden as a bigger threat to their own position, and signed a truce with Poland-Lithuania to fight Sweden together. Khmelnytsky didn't just abandon his own fight with Poland, however, and without officially breaking his alliance with Moscow, signed a treaty with Sweden and her allies, according to which he would receive the Ukrainian lands still held by Poland-Lithuania upon their defeat. Poland-Lithuania was not defeated, however, and in 1657, Bohdan Khmelnytsky died without ever seeing the Rus lands reunited. This point arguably marks the beginning of the period of Ukrainian history called the Ruin, though some historians place the start of this period later. This period is characterized by a constant string of internal conflicts and continuous division, which would only end in 1687 with the ascension of Hetman Ivan Mizapa, with a Ukrainian phrase about the period saying, "There was no Hetman from Bohdan to Ivan." Khmelnytsky's immediate successor, Ivan Vyhovsky, apparently seeing the threat posed by increasing Russian influence since the Treaty of Pereyaslav, did a complete 180, and tried to forge a new alliance with Poland. Under the Treaty of Hadiach, a slightly rebordered Ukraine would have been reintegrated into Poland-Lithuania, but this time with the same rights and privileges as Poland and Lithuania, creating a new polish-lithuanian Ruthenian Commonwealth. While many of the old policies would be reinstated, including the return of landholdings to Polish nobles, this would put Ukraine in a much better position than it had been in up until this point, with the Commonwealth adjusting to accommodate them, just as they would be expected to adjust to accommodate the Commonwealth. Unfortunately for Vyhovsky, a sizable faction of Cossacks preferred Orthodox Russia to Catholic Poland, even though the treaty would set aside specific governmental seats for Orthodox representatives, and rebelled against him, while Russia launched an invasion of their own. Which makes this the first time that Russian forces and a pro-Russian faction of Ukrainians would fight to keep Ukraine out of a mutually beneficial union, but not the last. Vyhovsky cut his losses and fled to Poland, while Bohdan Khmelnytsky's son, Yuri, replaced him, and entered into a new, worse agreement with Moscow, ceding more of Ukraine's autonomy, including more Muscovite garrisons being stationed in Ukraine, the Tsar being involved in all elections, and the Ukrainian Church being subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchate. This new agreement was broadly unpopular, and when the war seemed to be turning in Poland's favor in 1660, Yuri switched sides again. Poland didn't offer another Treaty of Hadiach, instead offering Ukraine a place as a subordinate member of the Union once more, but Yuri accepted, which, in a shocking twist, resulted in no less hostility from within Ukraine as the previous agreement. Yuri was pushed to the left bank of the Dnieper, while the right bank became a separate Hetmanate under Russian authority. With this, Ukraine was effectively partitioned along the Dnieper, with Poland and Russia each holding sway over one half. 7 years later, the Russo-Polish War would conclude with the Treaty of Andrusovo, which made this partition official. Over the next few decades, both halves of Ukraine would see their autonomy whittled down by the empires which held sway over each of them, all the while racked with internal strife and Russo-Polish conflicts. The reign of Ivan Mazepa would see the end of the ruin, and also another attempt at Ukrainian independence, as after reuniting the two banks of the Dnieper under Russia, Mazepa attempted to seize independence through an alliance with Sweden. Unfortunately, this attempt failed miserably, and just led to further losses of autonomy over the 18th century, culminating with the abolition of the Hetmanate and the integration of Ukraine as a province of the Russian Empire. Ukrainian independence would have to wait until the 20th century to be realized once more, and as we've seen recently, that independence still hasn't been entirely secured. There are a lot of parallels we can draw between this history and today, and while a lot of these parallels can be fun, we have to remember not to take them too seriously, lest we make the mistake of exaggerating similarities or painting history as deterministic. That said, if there's one big takeaway we can draw from this history, it's that Ukraine has been shaped by centuries of domination by its neighbors, and through all of that, it still retains some sense of independent identity. How this identity is manifested has changed over time, and Ukrainians have never been a monolith, but what's clear is that they have been set apart from their neighbors for quite some time. Even when their history had been spent as a territory of Catholic Poland-Lithuania, they never simply lumped themselves in with their Eastern Slavic, Orthodox Christian neighbors. The Cossacks chose the Turkic Muslim Tatars as their first allies against Poland. Through all their conflicts, they hung on to this notion of Ukraine as a cohesive unit worthy of independence, and this notion stuck it out through centuries of domination and repression by their more powerful neighbors. So no matter what faux historical narratives you might hear from wannabe Tsars and their propagandists, remember, Ukraine isn't just a confused part of Russia. It's not new, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Slava Ukraini, and thanks for watching.